dos, uno.
Good afternoon. The Iberoamerican Network of Research in Law and Social Disciplines invite you to listen to the conference Cuestión De Confianza, Gender Skepticism, Violence, and the Colombian Peace Agreement, presented by Professor Kimi King, Juris Doctor and PhD in Political Science. Dr. Kim is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of North Texas, with years of experience in research related to gender, conflict, and Latin America. So for us, it's an honor to have a Dr. Kim with us today.
Hola, buenas tardes. Es un honor para mí poder acompañarlos hoy. Pido disculpas porque mi español es muy malo, pero quiero que supieras que esta es una gran oportunidad y esperamos poder continuar desarrollando relaciones de colaboración. Y ahora al inglés. I am, and I need to start sharing my screen. There we go. Share sound. Perfecto. So this research looks at trust and women as it relates to violence and support for the Colombian peace agreement. It is the work of also Daniela, as well as Diego Esparza and Jim Miernick, who I work with here at North Texas. Part of what we're trying to do with this project is to examine larger questions. So this is part of a bigger research agenda relating to trust, violence, gender, and of course, Colombia. We want to look at whether trust in institutions and conflict actors translates into support for the peace, and whether trust and victimization interfere with support for the peace, whether trust and support for peace relates to violence and personal experiences, and whether there are differences between men and women for all of the above. It's in essence looking at gender differences and the extent to which things change in the post-conflict period for women as compared to men. When we look at the research that's being done in Colombia, it is amazing, and we've learned so much in the past 15, 20 years from scholars, especially in Colombia, about trust in government and in the peace process and in conflict actors. But what's distinctive is that gender inequality continues for women after the active conflict ends. So are there differences that we should be looking at for whether and why women trust the peace? And what we suggest here is that we need to have a larger conversation about gendered, institutional, contextual, and individual approaches that may be needed to examine support for peace agreements. If we look at gender and trust, the relationship is complicated across the research, and I'll be happy to share the slides with you and a copy of the paper as when it's finally completed. But if you look across the research, we see differences in how gender is perceived and plays out in the context of the Colombian peace process. Colombia is particularly important to study, and I stress for everyone that studies conflict, human security, transitional justice, that you need to be studying Colombia, because Colombia has everything that we want to be able to understand about conflict and the long road to get to peace. When it comes to looking at Colombia, what makes it fascinating is that the duration, the context, the conflict actors, its evolution meant that victims, became victimizers and victimizers became victims. And when you look at the relationship with women, it's also complicated because while we always talk about women as being so important for the peace process, very little progress has been made since the 1990s when the issue of gender really came on the international stage, especially as it relates to the United Nations. So that discrepancy between rhetoric and action makes it difficult to fully understand how women process peace and their trust in it. But the study of gender and trust is also convoluted. When you look at research that I've done and my colleagues have done, I'm citing them here, we tend to treat women as a control variable and not a variable of interest. We tend to, some of the versions of this I've sent out have said you have to run everything in a full model. You can't separate men and women and analyze them separately. But there is a growing body of literature that says women are being used as a control variable inappropriately, that instead of trying to account for women, what you ought to be interested in studying is the impact of how women are different. It is a variable of interest that can give us insight into public support, especially for the peace agreement. And that's why it is a matter of trust between institutions, conflict actors, and also differences between the genders in terms of how they view this issue of trusting the peace. So what is the literature generally looking at issues of trust and believing in peace, supporting the peace, providing votes for the peace agreement, is that trust across not just Colombia, but everywhere where there has been conflict violence requires repeat interactions and this idea of feeling like there will be increased security and the provision of necessary services. And for women, this may be particularly important, and there may be differences between gender roles and their perceptions about how institutions or other conflict actors will treat them. So we know that there are correlations between trust for institutions and exposure to violence and victimization and support for specific actors like the president, or you have to support the FARC. Typically, the research has found that people who are more trusting in the FARC as conflict actors or more trusting in the peace agreement. But also remember that trust in peace agreements is influenced by gender disparities and perceptions of what these political institutions will do and the conflict actors involved. Additionally, trust in the peace process, we know from research, is related to the level of conflict violence experienced by the populations. And so in Colombia, geography is everything, and I know y'all know this very well. Personal victimization, again, across not just Colombia, but in countries around the world, if you have experienced personal victimization, it will lower levels of trust and especially support for peace agreements. So the argument we're making here today is that gender matters as a variable of interest, that war-torn societies serve only to reinforce gender disparities. Women lose trust in those environments where there are higher levels of violence. Just because the war is over in terms of active violence does not mean that women don't return to a situation where they're facing intimate partner violence, or they have lost a partner, and so they are more vulnerable in their community. And so when we're thinking about the environments, about higher levels of violence over an extended period of time, it's important to analyze the institutions and the conflict actors that have shaped that in the post-conflict period. Additionally, one of the interesting things that comes out about gender is that, and you see this in some of the research in Rwanda, is that single, and in Liberia too, after conflict, single persons who don't have a partner, it may be they're divorced, they lost their partner in the conflict, there was an enforced disappearance, whatever it may be, but single persons post-conflict have reduced economic capacity. And that may be, it may mean that that kind of isolation could increase support for the peace. But evidence is mixed on this. And the other thing that you see when looking at whether gender matters is whether the geographic location and the degree of isolation that people, including women, are experiencing will have the same kind of economic capacity effect, so that women in urban areas may have increased economic capacity. They may have access to government institutions. And so therefore, there may be differences between urban and rural areas. All right, so how are we going to go about doing this, looking at how gender matters? And so in this particular piece, I do qualitative stuff, but in this piece, we're focusing on a quantitative analysis of differences between men and women about these key points: institutions, conflict actors, the context, and individual experiences that are related to trust in the 2016 peace agreement. We are slowly expanding this to look then at the research beyond just this time period we're looking at here. But what we're looking at here is relying on data, which I know all of y'all already know from the Latin American Public Opinion Project, the barometers measures from LAPOP, looking at the Colombia 2016 survey that is in the field as the peace agreement is going through the process of being rejected by the Colombian people in a narrow election. And it's so nice talking to audiences in Latin America who already understand these things that many of our US American students do not understand. So we're going to use as our dependent variable support for the peace agreement from that question on the LAPOP barometer. And I'm using multivariate probit analysis, rely on stata. Just let me take care of, I'm happy to address in question and answer questions about the quantitative nature of this. But because we are using from all over the country and we are using data that will correlate across municipalities, we cluster on the municipality to correct for dependence of observations within the same cluster. So we're going to do it a little different. And the first model we're going to look at is going to look at all of these factors with a full model with male and female in that model. But then we do what all the other research does, which is we use females as a control variable. And we see if there are significant differences. But then we're going to break out a female model and only look at that same set of variables for women, and then the male model, which will only look at men. So these are our variables, our independent variables of interest in the model. And it's based on really, there's a wonderful piece in the Journal of Political Science of Latin America, JPLA in 2020, that does a really great series of articles. Everybody right now, go read them, looking at trust in Colombia. And And so when you look at that and how conflict actors play itself out, trust in institutions, and we're going to look at the major institutions that the LAPOP survey data asks questions on from 2016. Do you have trust in the executive? Do you have trust in the legislature? Trust in the Constitutional Court? And that looking at the trust in believing that the FARC will demobilize. That's for the trust in institutions that are drawn from the LAPOP data. Now let's look at individual factors. Violence is personal. Trust is personal. One of the things that feminist and gender scholars point out is that you can't separate the personal from the political. You can't talk about trust in an executive and belief in a court system if you are a battered woman, right? Or subject to some other kind of violence in your life. Additionally, beyond gender identity, we have to consider ideology on the right-left spectrum and whether you lean further to the right or further to the left. We also look at victim status, and we take a little bit of a different approach across the models in that we didn't just look at whether you were a victim of wartime violence or whether you're on the registry, but we also looked at whether you had lost a family member during the conflict, whether you had been a victim or anyone in your family had been a victim of just regular general criminal violence, not conflict violence, but criminal violence in the last 12 months. So we take an aggregated measure of victimhood to analyze it. Then we also look at interpersonal trust that LAPOP asks about. How much do you trust your community? And then we also analyze how people characterize their marital status. The contextual factors are pretty obvious. We look at urban, where does the respondent live? But then we draw on criminal sexual violence that is reported to the national police. We use an average per capita violence for municipality for the years 2000 to 2015. And then drawing on wartime sexual violence that's on the registry of victims there in Colombia. We take the 3 years prior to the peace agreement, 2013 through 2015, to again create an average per capita violence for each municipality across Colombia. So what are our hypotheses? Here we go. I'm putting that there. Thank you. We're not going through all of these hypotheses today, but it's part of this larger agenda, and I'm going to talk about the results here as our focus for the rest of our conversation. But it's just laying out this idea. Women experience lower levels of trust about the peace across different conflicts, not just in Colombia. Women have lower levels of trust in institutions, and we see that persons who have, or at least the theory was, it doesn't play out here with us in the findings today, that people with left or liberal ideology would be more likely to support the agreement. Interpersonal trust, you have to trust your neighbor because there are effects that come from that would allow you to trust the broader community of your state. Persons in urban areas are more likely to have those resources. This will be particularly important for women. Victim status again. And keep in mind that we think it's important for scholars to have a conversation about not just conflict violence, but domestic criminal violence, the kind of lawlessness that prevails, that women are more subject to in the post-conflict phase and also in the conflict phase. So as we look now, turning to our results from the model, what I've done is to highlight here each of those variables that we've that I have discussed with you with the hypotheses, you'll see that not all of the variables work out the way we want them to, but that's okay. We find that trust, and this is things that other great Latin American scholars have already found. So I'm preaching to the choir here, I think. But we find that trust in the executive is clearly one of the most important factors in support for the peace agreement. And certainly you know this, having lived through the peace agreement and the process that led to its ultimate establishment and the challenges that the government continues to face with conflict actors. But note that it is significant across both men and women, women and men. In fact, what is striking is that we're so similar if we look at men and women across the institutional component of this. And so it explains why so many scholars find that there may be some effect from women, but a gender effect is never really significant on its own sometimes. It depends on the context and the conflict that you are studying about that. But now as we start to shift into those more personal variables, those variables that gender scholars say can have more of an impact, we see a little bit more difference. And so if you look at female, for starters, this is only in the full model. It doesn't appear in these models because we have divided out only the female responses and only the male responses into two separate models. So here, female is not significant. It just isn't. It's getting there, but it's not. Ideology then doesn't matter. Well, it's not significant for female or male, but when you combine them together, you seem to be getting this hanging at the borderline effect. It is only significant at the 0.05 level, but it's an indication that it is that collective ideology that might be contributing to support for the peace agreement, because we don't find individual effects. It's also interesting when you look at victim status that we see that, again, it's a small effect, but it is significant to the 0.05 level, that women who are less likely, I need to be explaining the coefficients. I need to step back for a second. I'm so sorry. There's a positive effect out of the executive and out of trusting the FARC because the coefficient is positive, meaning that the more you trust the executive, the more you trust the peace agreement. People who are more likely to trust the FARC are more likely to trust the peace agreement. But when it gets to ideology, this combined model that we have here, the more left you are, the less likely you are to trust the peace agreement, which is an interesting finding given some other research on Colombia. If we look then at victim status, the negative coefficient means that if you've experienced victimhood, either you have somebody in your family had conflict violence, or somebody in your family or yourself have been victims in the last year of just domestic criminal violence, you are actually less likely to trust the peace agreement, indicating that as governments think about how do we get them to trust this peace agreement, you need to make sure you're looking not just at victims of the conflict violence, but those who are continuing to experience domestic criminal violence. When we separate out victimhood and run this separately, I'm not showing you those results. Victimhood is not significant for either in terms of trusting the peace agreement. Then how much do you trust your community? Again, like ideology, we have this sort of effect where aggregated together, men and women are producing that if you have greater levels of interpersonal trust in your community, right? The question is phrased. Now, speaking of people around here, we talk of those on the left and those on the right. According to the terms left and right have for you, thinking of your own political leanings, where would you place yourself on the scale for ideology? Wait, did I read? I'm so sorry. That's for ideology. And then for interpersonal trust, it says, now speaking of people around here, would you say people in your community are not trustworthy, unreliable, somewhat trustworthy, or very trustworthy? So striking that these two variables behave the same way and something we think you ought to consider. Again, there is a distinctive thing that happens, and there's a gender difference between men and women that if you are single, again, modest significance. I put a lot of caution on this because these are sort of preliminary results taking this gendered approach. That women who are single are more likely to trust the peace. Then finally, if we start to look at the context of the violence, this is separate from the two variables here are separate from LAPOP data. The urban variable comes from LAPOP data. Is the municipality in an urban or a rural area? And in 2016, that survey had about 1/3 in rural areas and 2/3 in urban areas. The criminal sexual violence is that domestic sexual violence that occurs that are that we went back 15 years and analyzed the police data on it to give an average per capita by municipality. And we find that neither for men nor women does the overall, this is just the aggregate sexual violence. And I also put a caveat on this because criminal sexual violence, even in the best of times, is underreported. We estimate, and statistics vary in Colombia, but I know generally when you look at statistics of reporting sexual violence, less than anywhere between 1 to 10% actually wind up being reported. So I think there are also problems with using this as a variable, but we then, and it's not significant for either men or women, but I will point out that it is positive, and that is that if there are higher levels of sexual violence, you are more likely to trust the peace. What's interesting then is when you get down here to wartime sexual violence. And that's what's drawing from the victim registry and relying on that data per capita by municipality. And you see that in the full model, it's significant. It's also significant in the female model. It's positive, meaning that the higher rates of per capita violence, the more likely to trust the peace. Interesting. And it may be that one of our findings is that you need the peace more in these kinds of contexts of sexual violence. While some had speculated that it would not be significant for men, it holds up for men. Be careful, its significance is modest. It's only to the 0.05 level. But it's important to keep in mind that these men are also allies in our views about sexual violence and stopping it. So what I'm presenting here are really just the marginal effects, and quantitative scholars, forgive me for this, but I just want to make sure that we're going through the variables that were significant. All we're doing with the marginal effects is just looking at the change in probability of an outcome as you move from a 1-unit change in an independent variable, holding all other variables constant. And you're basically just getting a measure of the probability, the odds ratio of that change. And so as you shift in unit of support from not trusting the executive to not knowing whether you trust the executive to trusting the executive, it's a 26% increase. If you look across the variables, and remember, this is measured in violence per capita of 100,000. So you can't really look at the magnitude on these because the variables themselves were a little weird because they were per capita rates out of 100,000. But if you look across the variables that are truly important to be looking at as a percentage comparison, what you see is that trust in the executive exerts the greatest influence, and lots of other great research on Colombia has found this. You also find that trust in the FARC is important, although you find much lower rates of trust in the FARC in the LAPOP data. But you still see that it exerts about a 19% increase in the likelihood that you would support the peace. So the more you trust the FARC, the more you trust the peace. Females not significant, right? There's kind of a minor effect anyway, which might indicate why we maybe shouldn't use it as a control or at least compare the different models. When it comes to ideology, you've got to remember that this is on a 10-point scale. So any move is only 1% as you move from 1 to 10 in terms of your ideology. So it's not exerting that much of an influence, but again, still important. Same is true with interpersonal trust, right? There's a minor effect. Although keep in mind that with ideology, the more to the left you are, the less likely you are to trust the peace. Whereas with interpersonal trust, the more likely, the more interpersonal trust you have, the more likely you are to trust the peace. Then victim status, minor. That's why I say these are modest contributions to our understanding, but victim status is important, as is single status. We tried interacting victim and single, and this is a fairly complicated model, and the model does not converge. And so we need to explore other reasons. Our first concern was to go look at collinearity. And for all you quantitative people out there, I have a ton of collinearity statistics I would be more than happy to talk with you about. But we want to keep in mind and start thinking more about women's roles in addition to their identities and how victim status or single status plays into that support for the peace agreement. And again, you know, this is just showing you the magnitude in the difference. I think the one thing I would just kind of point out is that this difference, the most important finding, I think, from the wartime sexual violence is that both men and women it correlates with their support for the peace, and that we ought to be exploring more what that means for gender roles in the post-conflict phase. So this is a bunch of model stuff that I'm happy to talk about, but this can be sometimes where everybody glazes over and goes, it's what time in the afternoon? I just wanted to show you that if we look at our models, because is one model better than the other? We can compare the models, and that's what we do in this next phase. So if you look at the overall reduction of error for both models, you can see that we reduce making mistakes, meaning that if we use our model, we can predict more accurately support for the peace agreement. We have the largest reduction of error with the female model. And as we're going to see in any number of different indicators, the female model is the model that holds up for providing the best explanatory power, given our theory of support for peace agreements, with both men and with men and the full model being roughly the same. Here are the ends. We use a lot of different variables from LAPOP, and not all the survey respondents answer. There were over 1,500 variables that start out, and by the time we use all of our variables for missing LAPOP data, we're down to about 1,300. There's the split, so we have a gender approximation. These are just simply statistics of our model. But when we look at the pseudo R-squared, the model that seems to work the best is the female model. Then the then the full model works best after that. And then finally, the male model is last. And all the pseudo R-squared is telling us is what percentage of what we're explaining here can be attributed to your model. And so we've explained through that model about 24% for the full model, 27% for the female model, and then the male model performs at the lowest level of 0.21. These are just the clusters on the municipality. Those of you who know LAPOP know that they don't necessarily get every single place all over the country, and the log likelihoods. So what do we got here, people? Where do we go? Yeah, women are less likely. When you run just the pure numbers of men to women in the LAPOP data to support, they're less likely to support the peace agreement. But it depends not on trust in all institutions, nor does it depend on institutions alone. Both men and women have similar levels of significant trust in the executive, and that correlates with support for the peace agreement, but trust in the legislature and the judiciary are insignificant. I do need to point out, though, that on this question about the judiciary, under a reduced model, a model that wasn't taking into consideration what we consider to be the full theoretical importance of what we're trying to look at, trust for the Constitutional Court pops up for women. And I think that we ought to continue to look at differences between the institutions. I do want to note as a caveat, we tried using the variable with military and trust in the military, and military runs so collinear with the other institutional variables of trust that the model does not work. So the FARC, everybody's already found this already. If you trust the peace, you probably have some baseline of trusting the FARC. And then, of course, the issues about ideology and the fact that he doesn't hold up when you break apart men and women. We need to look at victims of violence and their support, as well as interpersonal support. In other research I did on the former Yugoslavia, we found that victims and witnesses who testified at the tribunal were actually, interestingly, that greater levels of violence that they had encountered led them to higher levels of support for the tribunal and the work it was doing, which is striking. That you're seeing these differences in the results. But what also mattered for persons at the former Yugoslavia tribunal is that their communities that were shattered also had an effect on their supports for the tribunal. So if they didn't trust people in their community, they did not trust that tribunal. Single women, I think I've said enough times, I really do feel like I want to move to the question and answer stage. Danny, can we go ahead and do that? I've talked way too much. I know I'm supposed to have 45 minutes, but I really want to hear, I can put the questions up there and I can go back to this last slide in terms of conclusions and what we take away from here. I really would like to open it up and talk to people that are out there for questions that you have. Thank you.
Yes, of course, Dr. Kimi, we have some questions about the presentation. The first one that I think that is one of the most interesting ones is it's possible to replicate this methodology, this model that you are presenting today in other research on gender and territories?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's starting to happen. And in fact, yes. And if you're saying replicate, I want to make sure I fully am understanding the question. The LAPOP data, but there's a Eurobarometer that you can look at. There's all kinds of public opinion data that you can put in conjunction with demographic and individualized data to allow you to look at different contexts of violence.
Okay. Another question that the public has is how could it be possible for the communities that are victims of the conflict to have trust again in the peace process?
That is such a big, important question.
Yeah.
And such a good one. And honestly, I feel like Colombia is helping the rest of the world try to figure it out. I don't know. It's one of the issues that you see with victims in any context. Like, let's just take apart conflict violence. And if you look at intimate partner violence, just domestic violence, just boyfriend, girlfriend mix it up and it's violent. You see that it becomes difficult over time. Trust erodes in that individual context. So we think that it's like on steroids, that it's really magnified when you have this kind of violence over the period of time that you have. One of the questions I asked at the beginning was, do women trust? We started out with this research question among males and females on the group. Do women trust the peace? Why don't they trust the peace? And I think my response would be, why should we trust the peace? Why should victims of these communities trust the peace? What has the peace ever done for them, right? And I think that the best way to approach it is to take off little pieces of that puzzle. So trust is reiterated. That was part of our theory, right? It becomes through iterations. So you have to have repeat interactions with those actors, with those institutions, with your community that are good and that build. And that, it's thought, will help rebuild the peace. Oh, such a good question. Did I answer it? Are you good?
Yeah, you answered the question. We have other one, and it's about the distinction between domestic violence and gender violence. Why do you use in your methodology the word domestic violence and no the more bigger question that is violence of gender or gender violence?
Thank you for that excellent save. Mi español es muy malo. And when I use the word domestic, I am using it as inside the country, domestic as opposed to international. So we are only looking at rates of sexual violence. It could have been an unknown perpetrator that committed the violence. It could have been, it is disproportionately male to female sexual violence, but I'm not trying to make a distinction between domestic violence and gender violence. I'm talking about the kind of criminal violence that is sexual violence that occurs not because of the conflict, just because there are people like, I'm going to take advantage of this situation, right? So it has not to do with the conflict. It's simply a result of, is there sexual violence that's occurring? And I think the person asking it is making a really important point that gender scholars need to consider. And that is, how does violence play out? Is it different if you're robbed, or if your house is broken into, or if you're sexually assaulted, or if it's attempted murder? And so you'll see that Esparza and Mirnik are also doing a lot of work with like the police and the military on data, trying to kind of suss out some of these factors related to trust and rebuilding of society. I hope that answered it.
Yeah. Well, we have two other questions. This is about the on the result present. You have any hypothesis as to why, in the case of women, there is a relation between the degree of trust between the peace process and the government?
Yeah. So there's a bunch of stuff I didn't include in here because you're Colombia and you guys already are Latin American. You already know a lot about this stuff. I would make the argument that it goes back to the fact that, where did we, if I'm going to really go to, it starts out with the failure of women to be involved in the peace process in Colombia and continues through, I would argue, to this day. The idea that if you look at on the negotiation teams that were sent out, if you look at Betancourt and the percentages, these are the percentages on the team looking at negotiating the peace. Women just simply weren't part, they just simply weren't part of the process. I also think that there's a distinction in the kind of violence that occurs that we ought to be looking at. So this is our maestra running this. This is the Constitutional Court data looking at the violence that was experienced and differences between men and women. And so you see there are certain kinds of violence where men and women are different. And one is on this sexual integrity violence where the violence is carried out. But then if you look at men, men have much higher rates of kidnapping, psychological personal injury, torture, physical personal injury, right? They have, and then off the chart of explosive devices. And so I think that also the type of violence and how you experience it makes a difference. And that accounts for women as well. But just overall, I mean, what's the peace agreement ever done for them? In fact, if you look at peace agreements, when men, and one of the things that happens is that when men come back, when there's a negotiated peace, it actually displaces women. So women had jobs, they were doing things. He was off fighting the war, right? I had to do this stuff. And what you'll see is that when men come home, you can actually create economic disparities in the family. She returns to traditional roles. There may be higher rates of, I'll call it intimate partner violence instead of domestic violence. There may be higher rates of intimate partner violence because now they're realizing they don't like living so much together anymore. And so I think that there's a great book called Sex and World Peace in 2012. And the argument is war schmore. Nothing changes for women. The violence is different. Maybe it's not as bad, but we go back to the same economic disparities, economic inequality, all of this stuff, and nothing has changed. And so that contributes, I think, greatly.
To finish, we have a comment about the presentation, and it says that it could be, we could say that the problem of trust in the peace process is not a gender problem, but has other factors of greater relevance. It's more economic, social, and government problem than a problem of gender.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I love very valid. And we have versions of the model that we talk about that include the economic variables. It is, the model does not work as well. Part of it's, you had another question about replicating the data, is that the LAPOP data don't come from all the regions of Colombia. And in fact, there are areas that are still war-torn where you can't get people into the field to do the survey. And so the point you are making is excellent. And economic disparities play out more in those war-torn regions where the violence is still going on and where the LAPOP survey is not doing. And so you've just reminded me why we ought to just look at these data that look at wartime sexual violence, and we could look at things that would get at some of that economic impact in those war-torn areas and allow us to look across all of Colombia for economic indicators. Yeah, great point. Absolutely. We have to put a footnote in there that says the moment there are other factors, because we are focusing on our gender model.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kimi. We have really appreciated your time in this conference. We have a really good time understanding all these projects and this paper that we are writing right now. And we are thankful for your participation in the permanent seminary of the Iberoamerican Network of Research in Law and Social Disciplines. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a todos los que nos acompañaron el día de hoy y agradecemos su participación dentro del Seminario Permanente de la Red Iberoamericana de Investigaciones en Derecho y Disciplinas Sociales. Gracias.
Gracias. Hasta luego. Chao.